Hello there, weary wanderer, and welcome to this tranquil corner of history. Before we begin our gentle journey back to the bustling lanes and quiet hearths of medieval village life, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're settling in for the night, ready to drift into peaceful slumber, or simply seeking a quiet escape from the modern world, I'm delighted you've chosen to join me this evening. If you don't mind sharing, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a joy to see our diverse community of history enthusiasts gathered here from every corner of the globe. And if you enjoy this style of gentle, immersive storytelling from the past, please consider clicking that subscribe button so you won't miss our next peaceful exploration. But for now, let the stresses and hurries of contemporary life melt away as we travel back to a time when life moved at the rhythm of the seasons and the tolling of church bells. Picture yourself stepping through the morning mist into a world where time seemed to flow like honey, where the greatest urgency might be the need to bring in the harvest before the autumn rains. A world where your neighbours knew your name, your troubles and your joys, where the boundaries of your existence were marked not by city limits or postal codes, but by the fields you could walk to before sunset. Imagine the soft crunch of straw beneath your feet as you walk down a narrow dirt path, flanked on either side by modest wooden houses with their thatched roofs golden in the early light. The air carries the mingled scents of wood smoke, fresh bread, and the earthy richness of recently turned soil. Somewhere nearby, a rooster announces the dawn, and the gentle lowing of cattle drifts from the common pasture beyond the village green. This is the medieval village, a world both simpler and more complex than we might imagine. The medieval village was far more than just a collection of houses scattered across the countryside. It was a complete ecosystem of human activity, a carefully balanced community where every person had their place and every place had its purpose. These villages were the beating heart of medieval society, home to the vast majority of people who lived during those distant centuries. While we often think of the Middle Ages in terms of grand castles and mighty cathedrals, the truth is that most medieval lives unfolded in these humble settlements, where the drama of daily existence played out against a backdrop of fields, forests, and familiar faces. At the centre of nearly every medieval village stood the parish church, its stone tower or wooden spire rising above the surrounding homes, like a gentle guardian watching over the community. The church was far more than a place of worship, though worship was certainly central to medieval life. It served as the village's social hub, meeting place, and often its most impressive architectural achievement. The churchyard, with its weathered headstones and ancient yew trees, was where generations of villagers had been laid to rest, creating an unbroken chain of memory stretching back through the centuries. On Sundays and holy days, which were numerous throughout the medieval year, the entire village would gather within those sacred walls. The wealthy merchant might stand near the front, his fine woolen cloak a stark contrast to the rough homespun garments of the farmer behind him. Yet both would kneel on the same cold stone floor and listen to the same Latin prayers echoing from the rafters above. The church bells that called them to prayer also marked the rhythms of their working days, tolling at dawn to wake the village, at midday for the brief rest from labour, and at dusk to signal the end of another day's toil. Surrounding the church, the village spread outward in what might seem like haphazard fashion to modern eyes, but which followed patterns both practical and ancient. The houses clustered together for mutual protection and companionship, their gardens and small plots extending behind them like green fingers reaching toward the common fields beyond. These weren't the neat suburban rows we know today, but organic growths that had evolved over generations, each building placed where it made the most sense for drainage, defence, and access to the village's shared resources. The houses themselves told the story of their inhabitants' place in the medieval world's carefully ordered hierarchy. The lord of the manor, if he resided in the village rather than in a distant castle, might possess a substantial stone house with multiple rooms, glass windows that caught and scattered the precious sunlight, and perhaps even a private chapel where his family could hear mass without mixing with the common folk. His dwelling stood like a small fortress of privilege, its very stones proclaiming his elevated status to all who passed by. The village priest, too, enjoyed accommodations that reflected his important role in the community. The rectory or parsonage, often built of the same enduring stone as the church itself, provided him with comfortable quarters befitting a man of learning and spiritual authority. Here he kept his precious books, perhaps one of the few collections of written knowledge within many miles, and here he prepared the sermons that would guide his flock through the challenges and celebrations of their earthly existence. But the vast majority of village homes belonged to people of far more modest means. The typical peasant dwelling was a humble affair, constructed primarily of wood and thatch, with walls that might be made of wattle and daub, a mixture of interwoven sticks covered with clay, mud and straw. These houses were small by our standards, often consisting of just 1 or 2 rooms where entire families would eat, sleep and spend their evening hours. The floors were usually nothing more than packed earth, perhaps covered with rushes or straw that could be changed when they became too soiled. Yet these simple homes possessed a warmth and character that transcended their humble materials. The central hearth, around which the family's life revolved, cast dancing shadows on the walls and filled the space with the comforting crackle of burning wood. Above the fire, blackened pots hung from iron chains, slowly cooking the evening meal of pottage, a thick stew that might contain whatever vegetables the family had managed to grow, perhaps enriched with a precious bit of meat on special occasions. The smoke from the fire found its way out through a simple hole in the roof, though much of it lingered inside, giving these homes their characteristic smoky atmosphere that seemed to embrace the inhabitants, like an old, familiar blanket. The windows in these modest homes were small and few, often nothing more than shuttered openings that could be closed against the wind and rain. Glass was a luxury far beyond the reach of common folk, so when the shutters were closed for warmth or privacy, the interior would be lit only by the glow of the hearth and perhaps a precious candle or oil lamp saved for special occasions. This intimate lighting created an atmosphere of coziness and togetherness that drew families close around the fire, where stories were told, songs were sung, and the wisdom of generations was passed from parent to child in the soft flickering light. Each village home was surrounded by its own small plot of land, a precious garden where the family grew the vegetables that would sustain them through the long months of winter. Here grew the sturdy cabbages and turnips, the onions and leeks, the beans and peas that formed the foundation of the medieval diet. These gardens were tended with loving care, for the difference between a good harvest and a poor one might mean the difference between comfort and hunger in the cold months ahead. Behind the village, proper stretched the great open fields that defined medieval agricultural life. These vast expanses of cultivated land were divided not into the individual farms we might expect, but into long, narrow strips assigned to different families according to ancient custom and feudal obligation. This system, known as the three-field system, was a marvel of medieval agricultural innovation that allowed the community to maximize their harvest while maintaining the fertility of their soil. In any given year, one field would be planted with wheat or rye, the precious grains that would provide the flour for daily bread. Another field might be sown with barley or oats, crops that could feed both humans and the vital livestock that provided milk, eggs and muscle power for the heavy work of farming. The third field would lie fallow, resting and recovering its strength while grazing animals fertilized it with their droppings, preparing it for the next season's planting. This rotation of crops and fallow periods required careful coordination among all the village families, for the timing of planting, tending and harvesting had to be synchronized across the entire community. When the time came to plough, all the village's oxen and horses would be brought together to break the heavy soil. When harvest time arrived, the entire community would turn out to gather in the precious grain before autumn storms could destroy it. These were times of intense cooperation, when the survival of the whole village depended on everyone working together toward a common goal. The agricultural rhythm that governed village life was punctuated by moments of celebration and ceremony that marked the turning of the seasons and the progress of the farming year. Plough Monday, falling in early January, celebrated the blessing of the ploughs and the beginning of another cycle of cultivation. May Day brought garlands of flowers and dancing around the village maypole, a joyous celebration of spring's return and the promise of another growing season. Harvest festivals in late summer and early autumn gave thanks for the year's bounty and prepared the community for the quiet months ahead. Between the houses and the fields lay the village green, a common area where the community's animals could graze under the watchful eyes of the village children who served as shepherds. This green space also served as the village's social centre, where markets might be held, where travelling entertainers would set up their simple stages, and where the important business of community life was conducted under the open sky. On market days, the green would transform into a bustling centre of commerce and conversation. Farmers would bring their surplus vegetables, eggs and dairy products to trade with their neighbours. Craftsmen would display their handiwork, from simple wooden bowls and iron tools to finely woven cloth and leather goods. Travelling merchants might arrive with precious commodities from distant places, exotic spices, fine fabrics or metal goods that the village's own smiths could not produce. These market gatherings were far more than mere economic transactions. They were vital social events, where news was shared, marriages were arranged, disputes were settled, and the bonds of community were renewed and strengthened. Young people might catch the eye of a potential spouse from a neighbouring village, while elders exchanged wisdom and gossip with friends they had known for decades. Children ran between the stalls, wide-eyed with wonder at the variety of goods and people that transformed their familiar green into a temporary wonderland of possibility and excitement. As evening approached and the market crowds dispersed, the village would settle into its quieter rhythms. The animals would be brought in from the fields, families would gather around their hearths for the evening meal, and the soft glow of firelight would begin to twinkle from the windows of homes throughout the settlement. The church bells would toll the hour of vespers, calling the faithful to evening prayer, and gradually the sounds of daily activity would give way to the peaceful stillness of another day's end in the medieval village. The gentle transition from day to evening in the medieval village was marked by rituals as old as the settlement itself. As the last light faded from the western sky, families would secure their precious livestock in simple wooden shelters, ensuring that the milk cow, the few sheep, and perhaps a pig or two were safely protected from the wolves and wild boars that still roamed the dark forests surrounding the village. The chickens would be coaxed into their rough hen houses, their soft clucking a familiar evening sound that spoke of eggs for tomorrow's breakfast and the comforting continuity of daily life. Inside the humble homes, the evening meal was a sacred time of gathering and gratitude. The entire family would crowd around their single wooden table, if they were fortunate enough to own one, or simply sit in a circle on the packed earth floor near the warm glow of the hearth. The meal itself was simple, but nourishing, usually consisting of that ever-present pottage, supplemented by coarse dark bread, perhaps a bit of cheese if the family kept a goat, and occasionally a precious egg or small piece of salted pork saved for special occasions. The medieval peasant's diet was monotonous by our standards, but it was carefully adapted to the realities of their world. Grains formed the foundation of every meal, whether ground into flour for bread, boiled into porridge, or fermented into the weak ale that even children drank daily, for it was often safer than the village's water supply. Vegetables from the family garden added variety and vital nutrients, while herbs like parsley, thyme and sage provided both flavour and medicinal benefits that helped ward off the illnesses that could devastate a medieval household. Meat was a luxury that graced most peasant tables only on feast days and special celebrations. When a family pig was slaughtered in late autumn, it was an event that involved the entire household in the careful process of preserving every scrap for the lean winter months ahead. The meat would be salted, smoked, or made into sausages, while even the bones would be saved for soup and the fat rendered into precious lard for cooking and lighting. Nothing was wasted in a world where waste could mean hunger. After the evening meal, as the family gathered around the dying embers of the fire, the real magic of medieval village life would unfold. These were the hours when stories were told, when the oral traditions that connected the present generation to their ancestors came alive in the flickering light. Grandparents would recount tales of their own youth, of hard winters survived and good harvests celebrated, of the time the travelling players came to the village and performed a miracle play in the churchyard, or of the year the Lord's son was married and every villager received a portion of wedding feast. Children would listen with wide eyes to stories of brave knights and noble ladies, of dragons defeated and princesses rescued, tales that had been passed down through countless generations and would be passed down to countless more. These stories served not merely as entertainment, but as a vital means of preserving the community's history, values, and dreams in a world where few could read, and books were rarer than precious jewels. The women of the household would often spend these evening hours engaged in the endless tasks of textile production that kept their families clothed and occasionally provided a small source of income. By the dim light of the fire, they would spin wool from their sheep into thread, their fingers working with the practiced skill of lifelong repetition. The soft whir of the spinning wheel and the gentle click of knitting needles created a peaceful soundtrack to the evening's conversations and storytelling. During the longer winter evenings, when outdoor work was impossible and the night stretched endlessly before dawn, these textile tasks became even more important. Women would work on the elaborate embroidery that decorated their family's best clothing, creating beautiful patterns that reflected both artistic skill and the desire to honour God and celebrate life's special moments. Even the humblest peasant dress might be adorned with simple but lovely decorative stitching that transformed rough homespun into something approaching elegance. The men would use these quiet hours for their own crafts, carving wooden spoons and bowls, mending tools and harnesses, or working on the thousand small tasks that kept a medieval household functioning. A farmer might spend the winter evenings crafting a new yoke for his oxen, carefully shaping the wood to fit the animals' necks perfectly, knowing that a well-made yoke could mean the difference between a successful ploughing season and back-breaking labour in poorly prepared fields. Children in the medieval village learned not through formal schooling, which was available only to the wealthy, but through this constant immersion in the activities and wisdom of their elders. A young boy would sit beside his father, watching intently as skilled hands shaped wood or mended leather, gradually absorbing the knowledge that would allow him to support his own family in years to come. A girl would help her mother at the loom and in the garden, learning the intricate skills of household management that would make her a valuable wife and capable mother. The rhythm of village life was punctuated by the changing seasons, each bringing its own particular challenges and rewards. Spring arrived with a burst of activity as the fields were prepared for planting. The gardens awakened from their winter slumber, and new life appeared in the form of lambs, calves and chicks that represented hope and prosperity for the year ahead. The entire village would come alive with the excitement of renewal as neighbours helped neighbours prepare for another growing season. Summer brought the intensive labour of tending crops, weeding gardens, and preparing for the all-important harvest that would determine the community's fate for the coming year. These were long days of back-breaking work under the hot sun, but they were also days filled with the satisfaction of seeing the fruits of their labour grow and ripen in the fields. The summer evenings were precious times of rest and socialising, when families might gather on the village green to enjoy the mild air and each other's company. autumn was perhaps the most crucial season in the medieval agricultural calendar. The success or failure of the harvest would determine whether the village would prosper or suffer through the long winter months. Every able-bodied person, from the smallest children to the most elderly grandparents, would contribute to the massive effort of gathering in the grain, threshing it, and storing it safely away from moisture and pests. The harvest festivals that followed a successful gathering were among the most joyous celebrations of the medieval year, times when the entire community could relax and give thanks for another year's survival. Winter brought its own particular character to village life. The frantic activity of the growing season gave way to a quieter rhythm focused on maintenance, preparation, and the indoor crafts that would sustain the community through the cold months. Families would gather closer around their fires, sharing warmth and stories while the wind howled outside their shuttered windows. These were times when the bonds of family and community grew strongest, when people depended most heavily on each other for companionship, support, and the simple comfort of human presence in the face of nature's harshest season. The medieval village was also shaped by its relationship with the broader feudal world of which it formed such an essential part. The lord of the manor, whether he lived in the village itself or in a castle some distance away, cast a long shadow over every aspect of village life. The peasants owed him not only a portion of their crops, but also their labour, working his personal lands for a certain number of days each week and providing additional service during the crucial periods of planting and harvest. This feudal relationship, though often burdensome, also provided the village with protection and stability in an uncertain world. The lord's armed retainers could defend the community against bandits and raiders, while his authority helped settle disputes and maintain order within the village itself. In times of particular hardship, a benevolent lord might provide grain from his own stores to prevent starvation, or timber from his forests to rebuild homes damaged by fire or storm. The village's relationship with the wider world was mediated through various intermediaries who brought news, goods, and new ideas from distant places. Travelling merchants were always welcome visitors, not only for the exotic wares they carried, but for the stories they told of life in other villages, other regions, other kingdoms entirely. These merchants served as living newspapers, carrying word of political changes, natural disasters, wars, and celebrations from settlement to settlement across the medieval landscape. Pilgrims, too, were common visitors to medieval villages, following ancient routes to holy sites and shrines throughout Europe and beyond. These religious travellers brought with them a different kind of news and wisdom, sharing stories of miraculous healings, holy visions, and the diverse expressions of faith they had encountered on their spiritual journeys. Villagers would often provide food and shelter to these pilgrims, seeing in their hospitality both a Christian duty and an opportunity to participate vicariously in the great spiritual adventure of pilgrimage. The parish priest served as another crucial link between the village and the broader medieval world. Often one of the few literate members of the community, he could read letters from distant relatives, interpret official documents from the Lord Steward, and provide guidance on matters both spiritual and practical. His education, though perhaps limited by modern standards, made him a repository of knowledge about everything from the proper times for planting to the correct procedures for baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Through the priest, the village remained connected to the great rhythms of the church calendar that governed medieval life far beyond the boundaries of any single settlement. The feast days and fasting periods, the seasons of penance and celebration that marked the Christian year, provided a framework of meaning that united the humblest village with the greatest cathedral cities in a shared experience of faith and community. The church bells that govern daily life also mark the passage of the liturgical seasons with their own distinctive rhythms and ceremonies. During Advent, the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, the village would take on an air of quiet anticipation. Families would prepare their homes as best they could for the celebration of Christ's birth. perhaps weaving fresh rushes for the floors, or carefully mending their finest garments for the Christmas Mass. The excitement was palpable, especially among the children, who knew that Christmas would bring not only spiritual joy, but also the rare treats that made winter bearable. The 12 days of Christmas transformed the medieval village into something approaching a fairyland of celebration. Even the poorest families would manage to find something special for their Christmas table, perhaps a goose saved and fattened through the autumn months, or a precious honey cake sweetened with the last of the summer's harvest from their carefully tended beehives. The village green would ring with the sound of carols sung in harmony by voices that had learned their melodies, not from written music, which few could read, but from the ancient oral tradition that preserved these songs across generations. During these festive days, the normal social boundaries that defined medieval life would blur in wonderful ways. The lord of the manor might invite the entire village to feast in his great hall, while servants and masters would exchange roles in the playful tradition of the lord of misrule. Children would go from house to house, singing carols and receiving small gifts of food or coins, their bright voices carrying joy through the crisp winter air. The wassailing tradition would see groups of villagers visiting the orchards with songs and cider, blessing the apple trees to ensure a good harvest in the coming year. Epiphany, on the 6th of January, marked the end of the Christmas season with its own special observances. The village children would often participate in simple pageants, reenacting the journey of the three wise men, their young faces glowing with pride as they processed through the village, carrying handmade stars and wearing crowns fashioned from whatever golden materials their families could provide. These humble performances, though simple by our standards, carried deep meaning for communities whose entertainment came not from distant professionals, but from their own creative expressions of faith and celebration. As winter deepened and the Christmas celebrations became cherished memories, the village settled into the quieter rhythms of the coldest months. February brought Candlemas, when all the candles that would be used in church throughout the coming year were blessed in a ceremony that filled the sanctuary with warm, flickering light. This festival of light in the depths of winter reminded the community that even in the darkest times, hope and warmth could be found in their shared faith and mutual support. The approach of Lent brought its own transformation to village life. The 40 days of preparation before Easter were marked by fasting, prayer, and acts of charity that drew the community together in shared sacrifice and spiritual preparation. Families would give up whatever small luxuries they possessed, perhaps the bit of honey they saved for special occasions or the ale they normally enjoyed with their evening meal. These sacrifices, though modest, represented real hardship for people whose daily existence already required constant, careful management of scarce resources. Shrove Tuesday, the last day before Lent began, was celebrated with particular enthusiasm as the final opportunity for indulgence before the long weeks of abstinence. Pancakes made from the last eggs and dairy products in the household were shared with neighbours, and the village might organise games and contests that brought everyone together in boisterous celebration. The pancake races, where contestants would run through the village streets while flipping pancakes in their pans, created memories that would be laughed about and retold for years to come. The coming of spring brought Easter, the most important celebration of the medieval Christian year. The village would prepare for weeks in advance, cleaning their homes from top to bottom in the great spring cleaning that served both practical and spiritual purposes. Gardens would be prepared for the new growing season, while inside the houses, families would begin the careful process of planning their year's work based on the resources they had managed to preserve through the winter months. Easter morning would see the entire village processing to church in their finest clothes, carrying flowers and greenery that symbolised the renewal of life after winter's death. The church itself would be decorated with whatever beautiful things the community could provide, from carefully preserved linens embroidered during the long winter evenings to branches of flowering trees that proclaimed spring's arrival. The Easter feast that followed would be modest by our standards, but magnificent in the context of medieval village life, featuring perhaps fresh eggs from the awakening hens, early greens from the garden, and maybe even a lamb if the community had been particularly blessed. The agricultural calendar that governed so much of village life reached one of its most crucial points with the celebration of Rogatiantide in late spring. During these 3 days before Ascension Day, the entire community would process around the boundaries of their village lands, blessing the fields and asking for divine protection of the crops that were just beginning to emerge from the soil. This ancient ceremony, part Christian ritual and part agricultural necessity, served to reinforce both the spiritual and practical bonds that held the community together. The village priest would lead this procession, carrying holy water to sprinkle on the newly planted fields, while the villagers followed behind, singing hymns and prayers for a successful harvest. At certain significant points along the route, perhaps near ancient standing stones, or at the boundaries between different fields, the procession would pause for special blessings and prayers. Young boys would often be lifted up, or even turned upside down at these boundary markers, a practice designed to help them remember the exact limits of their community's lands for the rest of their lives. These Rogation Day processions were more than merely religious ceremonies. They served the vital practical purpose of reinforcing the community's collective memory of property boundaries, water rights, and ancient agreements that govern the use of common lands. In a world where few written records existed and legal disputes could devastate a community, these annual walks around the village boundaries helped ensure that everyone understood and remembered the traditional arrangements that made their agricultural system possible. The late spring and early summer months brought a different kind of energy to the medieval village as the crops grew taller and the promise of harvest began to seem real. This was also the season when many villages would hold their annual fairs, events that brought together communities from miles around in celebrations of trade, entertainment, and social connection. These fairs were often timed to coincide with the feast day of the village's patron saint, combining religious observance with secular celebration in the characteristically medieval fusion of sacred and worldly concerns. The village fair was perhaps the most exciting event of the year for most medieval communities. For days beforehand, the village green would be transformed as temporary stalls, and booths were erected by local craftsmen and visiting merchants. The blacksmith would display his finest work, from horseshoes and farming implements to decorative metalwork that showed off his artistic skills. The village weaver would hang her most beautiful textiles where they could catch the light and attract the attention of potential buyers from neighbouring settlements. Travelling entertainers would arrive with their repertoires of songs, stories, and simple theatrical performances that brought wonder and laughter to people whose entertainment usually consisted of their own homemade amusements. Jugglers and acrobats would amaze the crowds with feats of skill and daring, while storytellers would hold audiences spellbound with tales of adventure and romance from distant lands. Musicians with their fiddles, pipes, and drums would provide the soundtrack for dancing that might continue long into the night. The fair also served important social functions beyond mere entertainment and commerce. Young people from different villages would meet and court under the watchful eyes of their parents, potentially beginning relationships that might lead to marriages linking different communities. Farmers would compare their techniques and share knowledge about new crops or improved methods of cultivation. News would be exchanged about everything from political developments in distant kingdoms to more immediate concerns about weather patterns and harvest prospects. Food vendors at the fair would offer treats that were rarely available in the ordinary course of village life. Honey cakes sweetened with precious imported spices, roasted nuts, and fresh fruit from regions with different growing seasons would tempt fairgoers to part with their carefully hoarded coins. Ale sellers would compete to offer the smoothest, most flavourful brews, while bakers would display loaves of fine white bread that contrasted dramatically with the coarse dark bread that formed the staple of most medieval diets. The religious aspect of these fairs was never far from the surface. The day would typically begin with a special mass in honour of the patron saint, followed by a procession around the village carrying the saint's relics or image. Pilgrims who had come to venerate the saint would mingle with merchants and entertainers, creating a unique atmosphere where spiritual seeking and worldly pleasure coexisted in harmony. The church would often set up its own booths, selling religious items like candles, holy medals, and small devotional books for those fortunate enough to be able to read. As evening approached and the fair began to wind down, families would gather to count their earnings and purchases, assessing how well they had done in the day's trading. Children would clutch their small treasures, perhaps a wooden toy or a sweet treat that would be remembered long after it was consumed. The visitors from other villages would begin their journeys home, carrying with them not only their purchases, but also stories and news that would enliven many winter evenings to come. The success of a village fair was measured not only in economic terms, but in the strengthening of social bonds and the renewal of the community's connection to the broader medieval world. A good fair brought prestige to the village, attracting visitors and merchants who might return throughout the year. It provided an opportunity for local craftsmen to build reputations that extended beyond their immediate neighbours, potentially opening new markets for their skills and products. The weeks following a successful fair would see the village settling back into its normal rhythms, but with a renewed sense of confidence and connection to the wider world. The coins earned during the fair would be carefully saved for the purchase of essential items that the village could not produce for itself, while the social connections made during the celebration might develop into lasting friendships and business relationships that would benefit the community for years to come. As summer reached its peak, the medieval village would begin the intensive preparations for harvest that would determine the community's survival through another winter. The grain in the fields would be watched anxiously for signs of ripeness, while families would prepare the tools and storage facilities needed for the crucial work ahead. Scythes would be sharpened, granaries cleaned and repaired, and plans made for the coordinated effort that would be required to gather in the crops before autumn weather could destroy them. This period of anticipation was filled with both hope and anxiety, for everyone understood that their lives quite literally depended on the success of the harvest. A good year would mean full bellies and comfortable fires through the winter months, while a poor harvest could mean hunger, cold, and possibly death before spring returned. The entire community would unite in prayer and preparation, knowing that their individual fates were bound together in the ancient rhythm of planting, tending, and gathering that had sustained human life since the beginning of agriculture. The medieval village, with all its hardships and limitations, represented a way of life that was both profoundly human and deeply connected to the natural world. In these small communities, every person mattered, every skill was valued, and every life was woven into the larger tapestry of community survival and celebration. As we drift towards sleep, perhaps we can find comfort in imagining ourselves part of such a community, where the rhythms of life moved in harmony with the seasons, and where the bonds of human connection provided warmth against even the coldest winter nights. The harvest season in the medieval village was perhaps the most intense and communal period of the entire year, a time when the artificial boundaries between families dissolved into a unified effort that would determine everyone's fate through the coming winter. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky with pale gold, the village would already be stirring with an energy that was both urgent and reverent. The grain stood tall and heavy in the fields, swaying gently in the morning breeze like a golden sea waiting to be gathered. Every member of the community, from children barely old enough to walk steadily to grandparents whose backs were bent with age, had a role to play in this crucial drama. The strongest men would take up their scythes, those long-handled tools with curved blades that had been lovingly maintained and sharpened through the preceding weeks. With rhythmic sweeps that spoke of generations of practice, they would begin the ancient dance of cutting, their movements creating a steady whisper as the stalks fell in neat rows behind them. The women and older children would follow close behind, gathering the cut grain into sheaves that would be tied with bands of twisted straw and left to dry in the warm summer sun. Their hands moved with practiced efficiency, yet there was an almost ceremonial quality to their work, as if they understood that they were participating in one of humanity's oldest and most sacred activities. The youngest children would dart between the workers, gleaning the scattered grains that might otherwise be lost, their bright laughter mixing with the more serious sounds of adult labour. The harvest was not merely work, but a celebration of community cooperation that revealed the medieval village at its finest. Neighbours who might have had minor disputes during the year would work side by side without hesitation, understanding that their personal differences meant nothing compared to the collective need to gather the grain before weather or pests could destroy it. The wealthy merchant would swing his scythe alongside the humblest peasant, while the lord's wife might find herself binding sheaves next to the village blacksmith's daughter. As the day progressed and the sun climbed higher, the harvesters would pause for meals that were themselves communal affairs. Tables would be set up in the shade of ancient oak trees at the field's edge, laden with food that had been prepared by those too old or too young to work directly in the grain. Great loaves of bread, wheels of cheese, jugs of ale, and perhaps even some precious meat would be shared freely among all the workers, regardless of their usual social standing. These harvest meals were times of storytelling and song when the oldest members of the community would share tales of legendary harvests from years past. They might speak of the year when a sudden hailstorm threatened to destroy the entire crop, only to be turned aside by the fervent prayers of the village priest. Or they would recall the harvest when a travelling minstrel happened to pass through just as the work began, lending his voice to work songs that made the labour feel more like a festival than toil. The songs that accompanied harvest work were themselves ancient treasures, passed down through countless generations of agricultural communities. These were not written compositions, but living pieces of folk culture that had evolved over centuries to match perfectly the rhythm of scything, the tempo of gathering, and the communal spirit of the season. The melodies were simple enough for everyone to learn quickly, yet beautiful enough to transform hard physical labour into something approaching art. As evening approached and the day's section of field lay neatly arranged in golden rows of drying sheaves, the harvesters would gather their tools and make their way back to the village with a satisfaction that was both physical and spiritual. The knowledge that another day's worth of winter survival had been secured filled everyone with a quiet pride, while the shared effort had strengthened the bonds of community that would sustain them through the darker months ahead. The threshing that followed the cutting was another community endeavour that required both skill and cooperation. The dried sheaves would be brought to the village's common threshing floor, usually a circular area of hard-packed earth that had been carefully prepared and maintained for this purpose. Here the grain would be beaten with flails, simple tools consisting of 2 wooden sticks joined by leather hinges to separate the precious kernels from their stalks. The rhythmic beating of multiple flails created a percussion that could be heard throughout the village, a sound that spoke of abundance and preparation for the future. Young people would often compete to see who could maintain the steadiest rhythm or who could work the longest without tiring, turning the necessary labour into friendly contests that made the work more enjoyable and built skills that would serve them throughout their lives. After the threshing came the winnowing, a process that required the subtle skill of reading wind patterns and understanding the different weights of grain and chaff. Women would toss the threshed grain into the air from large, shallow baskets, allowing the breeze to carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier kernels fell back into the container. This delicate work required patience and experience, qualities that were highly valued in the medieval community. The grain that emerged from this careful process was more than mere food. It was security, comfort, and life itself stored away for the hungry months ahead. Every kernel represented hours of labour, weeks of anxious watching, and the culmination of an entire year's agricultural efforts. The sight of the granaries slowly filling with golden wheat and barley brought a deep satisfaction to the entire village, a sense of accomplishment that transcended individual achievement to become a shared victory over uncertainty and want. But harvest was not only about grain. The village gardens would also be yielding their bounty during these crucial weeks, providing the vegetables that would add variety and nutrition to the winter diet. Cabbages would be harvested and carefully stored in root cellars, their sturdy leaves promising fresh food even in the depths of winter. Turnips and parsnips would be pulled from the earth and packed away in sand or straw, while beans and peas would be dried and stored in sealed containers that would protect them from moisture and pests. The herb gardens that were so essential to medieval cooking and medicine would also be harvested during this season, their precious leaves and seeds carefully dried and stored for the long months when fresh plants would not be available. The village wise woman, often an elderly woman whose knowledge of herbs and healing had been accumulated over decades of experience, would supervise this delicate work, ensuring that each plant was gathered at exactly the right time and processed in the traditional manner that would preserve its potency. Apple orchards surrounding the village would hang heavy with fruit that would be gathered with the same communal spirit that marked the grain harvest. Some apples would be eaten fresh during the harvest season, a precious treat that added sweetness to the diet, while others would be carefully stored in cool, dry places where they might last for months. Many would be pressed into cider, creating the alcoholic beverage that was safer to drink than water and provided both nutrition and comfort during the winter months. The making of cider was itself turns at the Great Wooden, a community celebration, with families taking press that would extract the sweet juice from the fruit. Children would compete to see who could turn the press handle the longest, while adults would sample the fresh juice and debate the likely quality of the finished cider. The first taste of new cider was a moment of pure pleasure that marked the successful completion of another agricultural year. As the harvest season drew to its close, the medieval village would prepare for the great harvest festival that would celebrate the completion of their vital work. This was one of the most important celebrations of the year, rivaling even Christmas in its significance for agricultural communities. The church would be decorated with sheaves of grain, baskets of fruit, and displays of vegetables that represented the community's gratitude for another year's survival. The harvest festival combined religious observance with secular celebration in the characteristic medieval manner. A special Thanksgiving where the entire Mass would be held, community gathering to offer prayers of gratitude for the successful completion of their agricultural labours. The first fruits of the harvest would be blessed by the priest and then shared among the congregation, creating a communion that united the spiritual and material aspects of their existence. Following the religious observances, the celebration would move to the village green for festivities that might continue for days. Tables would groan under the weight of food prepared from the fresh harvest, while musicians would provide entertainment that encouraged dancing and singing that could be heard for miles around. These were times when the normal restraints of medieval life would be relaxed, when people could indulge in the pure joy of survival and abundance after months of uncertainty and toil. The lord of the manor would often participate in these celebrations, sometimes providing additional food and drink that elevated the festival to levels of luxury that the villagers rarely experienced. His presence at the celebration served not only to demonstrate his benevolence, but also to acknowledge his dependence on the agricultural success that his tenants had achieved. The feudal bonds that normally emphasized hierarchy and obligation would be softened during these festive times by the recognition of mutual dependence and shared accomplishment. Young people would use the harvest festival as an opportunity for courtship, with the relaxed atmosphere and communal celebration providing ideal conditions for romance to flourish. Many marriages could trace their beginnings to meetings during harvest festivals, when the joy of successful completion of the year's work created an atmosphere of optimism and possibility that encouraged young hearts to dream of shared futures. As the festival wound down and the village began to settle into the quieter rhythms of autumn, families would take stock of their preparations for winter. Granaries would be checked and secured, preserved foods would be inventoried, and plans would be made for the careful rationing that would ensure the harvest lasted until spring brought new growing possibilities. The success or failure of these preparations would determine not only comfort, but survival through the challenging months ahead. The transition from harvest celebration to winter preparation marked one of the most significant psychological shifts in the medieval agricultural calendar. The exuberant energy of the harvest season would gradually give way to the more introspective mood that characterized the darker months, when communities would turn inward and rely more heavily on the social bonds that had been strengthened during the busy season of shared labour. October brought its own particular tasks and rhythms to village life. This was the season when animals that could not be fed through the winter would be slaughtered, providing fresh meat for immediate consumption and preserved meat for the lean months ahead. The slaughter of a pig or cow was a significant event that would involve multiple families working together to ensure that every part of the animal was used efficiently. The process of preserving meat was both an art and a necessity that required skills passed down through generations. Salt, that precious commodity that had to be obtained through trade with distant regions, would be used to cure hams and bacon that would provide protein throughout the winter. Blood would be made into puddings, organs would be consumed fresh or preserved in their own fat, and even bones would be saved for the rich soups that would stretch other ingredients through the hungry months. The medieval village in autumn was a place of intense activity as families rushed to complete their winter preparations before the weather turned too cold for outdoor work. Firewood would be gathered and stacked in carefully arranged piles that would need to last until spring made outdoor work possible again. The quality and quantity of these wood piles were matters of life and death, for insufficient fuel could mean freezing in houses that had no other source of heat. Thatch roofs would be repaired and reinforced before winter storms could damage them, while walls would be checked for gaps that might let in deadly drafts. The small windows of peasant houses would be carefully sealed, sometimes with oiled cloth, or even sheets of thin scraped horn that would allow sunlight to enter while keeping out the worst of the winter cold. Inside the houses, families would prepare their winter clothing, mending and reinforcing garments that would need to last through months of hard wear. Wool would be spun into thread during the long winter evenings, while the thread from previous years would be woven into cloth on simple looms that were found in most village homes. These domestic crafts were not hobbies but essential survival skills that meant the difference between adequate clothing and dangerous exposure to winter weather. The medieval village preparing for winter was a community united by the common understanding that survival depended on careful preparation and mutual support. Neighbours would help neighbours complete essential tasks, knowing that the survival of each family strengthened the survival of all. The bonds of community that had been forged during the harvest season would be tested and strengthened during the challenging months ahead, creating relationships that would endure for generations. As November arrived with its shorter days and colder nights, the village would settle into the rhythm that would carry it through until spring returned. The frantic activity of autumn would give way to the more measured pace of winter crafts and indoor occupations, while the community would draw together around fires and hearths that provided not only warmth but the social centres around which winter life would revolve. The medieval village in winter was a world unto itself, largely cut off from outside contact by weather and darkness, but rich in the human connections that made survival not only possible, but meaningful. In these small communities, surrounded by the vast darkness of winter nights, people would find in each other the warmth and companionship that made even the harshest season bearable, creating memories and traditions that would be passed down through countless generations of village life. The long winter nights in the medieval village were illuminated not by the harsh electric glare we know today, but by the gentle flickering light of candles made from precious beeswax, or the more common but acrid glow of tallow candles fashioned from animal fat. These humble sources of light created pools of warm radiance in which families with the darkness around gather for the evening activities that made winter not merely a season to be endured, but a time of intimate connection and shared creativity. The candlemaker's craft was one of the essential skills that every village needed, though it was often practiced by families for their own use, rather than as a specialised trade. The process of rendering animal fat into tallow was a careful procedure that required patience and skill, as the fat had to be heated slowly and strained repeatedly to remove impurities that might cause the finished candles to smoke or burn unevenly. The lucky families who kept bees could produce the far superior beeswax candles, whose clean flame and pleasant honey scent made them treasured possessions reserved for the most important occasions. Even with these sources of artificial light, most village activities after dark were governed by the natural rhythms of firelight. The central hearth remained the beating heart of the medieval home, its flames providing not only warmth and light but also the means to cook food and heat water for the countless daily tasks that kept a household functioning. The arrangement of furniture and activity spaces around this central fire reflected its crucial importance, with the most comfortable seating positioned to take advantage of both warmth and illumination. The winter months were also the time when the village's oral traditions flourished most richly. Professional storytellers might occasionally visit even remote villages, bringing with them repertoires of tales that had been polished through countless tellings in communities across the medieval world. These wandering entertainers, often called minstrels or jongleurs, were welcomed not only for their skills, but for the news and gossip they carried from other places, connecting isolated winter communities to the broader world beyond their boundaries. But most of the storytelling that filled winter evenings came from within the community itself. Every village had its recognised storytellers, individuals whose gift for narrative and memory made them treasured keepers of the community's cultural heritage. These might be elderly grandparents whose long lives had given them vast stores of personal experience to draw upon, or younger people whose natural talent for dramatic presentation made even familiar stories seem fresh and exciting. The stories themselves covered every aspect of human experience, from heroic tales of knights and battles to humble anecdotes about village life, from religious narratives that reinforced Christian teachings to ancient folk tales that preserved pre-Christian traditions in barely disguised forms. Ghost stories were particularly popular during the long winter nights, perhaps because the darkness outside made supernatural terrors seem more plausible and immediate. These tales served purposes far beyond mere entertainment. In a largely illiterate society, storytelling was the primary means of preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge, moral values, and historical memory. Children learned about proper behaviour, social expectations, and the consequences of various choices through stories that embedded these lessons in memorable narrative forms. The repetition of these tales, with slight variations that reflected each teller's personality and circumstances, ensured that essential cultural information was preserved and passed down through generations. Music was another art that flourished during the winter months, when families had time to practice and perfect their skills on simple instruments that could be crafted from materials available in any village. Wooden flutes carved from hollowed branches produced sweet melodies that could accompany singing or provide instrumental music for dancing. Simple drums, made from wooden frames covered with stretched animal skins, provided rhythm for community celebrations and religious ceremonies. The human voice, however, remained the most important musical instrument in medieval village life. Songs served many functions beyond entertainment, from work songs that helped coordinate group labour to lullabies that soothed children to sleep. Religious music formed a significant part of the village repertoire, with hymns and chants that had been learned from the church services becoming part of the domestic musical. Many traditions of these songs were ancient, their origins lost in the mists of time, yet they continued to speak to fundamental human experiences that transcended the centuries. Love songs, drinking songs, seasonal celebrations, and laments for the dead all found expression in melodies that were simple enough for anyone to learn, yet beautiful enough to move listeners to tears or laughter. The fact that these songs survived and spread without written notation testifies to their power to touch something universal in the human heart. Dancing was another winter activity that brought communities together in celebration and physical expression. The village green, which served as a dance floor during warmer months, might be too muddy or snow-covered for outdoor festivities, but the largest houses or even the church itself could provide space for the simple folk dances that were part of every village's cultural heritage. These dances were not the elaborate court performances that entertained the nobility, but simpler expressions of communal joy that could accommodate participants of all ages and skill levels. Circle dances that allowed everyone to participate regardless of their individual abilities were particularly popular, creating moving patterns that symbolized the unity and continuity of the community. The steps were passed down from generation to generation, with older dancers teaching younger ones the traditional movements that connected them to their ancestors and cultural heritage. The winter season also marked important transitions in individual lives, as families used the quieter months to plan and arrange marriages for their young people. Courtship in the medieval village was a community affair, conducted under the watchful eyes of parents and neighbours who had strong interests in ensuring that marriages would strengthen rather than disrupt the social fabric of the village. Young people might have met potential spouses during the harvest festivals or market days, but winter provided the opportunity for more formal negotiations between families. These discussions involved not only personal compatibility, but also practical considerations such as the economic resources each party would bring to the marriage, the skills and reputation of the prospective bride or groom, and the potential benefits or complications that the union might create for both extended families. The actual wedding ceremonies were typically planned for spring or early summer, when weather would permit outdoor celebrations and when the agricultural calendar would allow time for the elaborate preparations that marked these important life transitions. But the winter months were when the foundations for these future celebrations were laid, through careful negotiations and gradual courtship that allowed young couples to become acquainted under appropriate supervision. The medieval village also provided care for its most vulnerable members during the challenging winter months. Widows, orphans, and the elderly, who could no longer support themselves through their own labour, were not abandoned but were integrated into the community's survival strategies through systems of mutual aid that reflected both Christian charity and practical necessity. The parish church played a central role in organising this care, collecting tithes and donations that could be distributed to those in need. But informal networks of family and neighbourhood support were equally important, with relatives and neighbours sharing food, fuel and shelter according to ancient customs that recognised the interdependence of all community members. The village's care for its vulnerable members extended beyond mere physical survival, to include their participation in the social and cultural life of the community. Elderly people whose physical strength had diminished were valued for their knowledge and experience, while children without parents were often informally adopted by families who could provide for them. These arrangements were rarely formalised in written contracts, but were governed by understood obligations and expectations that were enforced by community, opinion, and religious teaching. Winter was also the season when many villages would host travelling craftsmen who could provide specialised services that were not available locally. A master carpenter might spend several weeks in a village, repairing tools and furniture, while teaching local apprentices advanced techniques. Metal workers might arrive with portable forges, mending broken implements, and creating new tools that would be needed for the coming agricultural season. These visiting craftsmen were more than mere service providers. They were links to craft the broader world of medieval craftsmanship and trade. They brought news of technical innovations, changes in fashion, and developments in their specialised fields that might eventually influence local practices. Their presence in the village was often marked by social events that celebrated both their skills and their role in connecting the community to distant places and different ways of life. The arrival of such visitors during the winter months provided welcome variety in the village's social life, offering new faces and fresh conversation during the season when communities were most isolated from outside contact. Families would compete for the honour of providing hospitality to these guests, not only because of the prestige involved, but because of the stories and knowledge they brought with them. The gradual lengthening of days toward the end of winter brought its own particular excitement to the medieval village. February and March were months of anticipation, when subtle changes in light and weather patterns suggested that the long season of cold and darkness was finally beginning to weaken. These early signs of spring's approach were watched with an intensity that we can barely imagine, for they represented not merely seasonal change, but the promise, the first through another winter, of survival appearance of early spring flowers, particularly the snowdrops that pushed through the last snow, was greeted with celebrations that might seem disproportionate to modern observers, but which represented profound relief and joy to people who had spent months wondering whether they would live to see another growing season. These simple flowers were more than botanical curiosities. They were symbols of hope, renewal, and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governed all life. Village children, who had spent the winter months largely confined to their homes by weather and darkness, would be among the first to venture out and discover these early harbingers of spring. Their excited reports would spread quickly through the community, drawing adults out to witness for themselves the small miracles that promised an end to winter's reign. These moments of shared discovery helped strengthen the bonds of community that had sustained the village through the challenging months. The preparation for spring's agricultural activities would begin long before the weather was actually warm enough for outdoor work. Tools would be brought out of repaired and safe storage examined, sharpened in anticipation of the coming planting season. Seeds preserved from the previous year's harvest would be sorted that had been carefully and tested, with families making crucial decisions about which crops to plant and how to allocate their limited land resources. These preparations were accompanied by a growing sense of excitement and possibility that contrasted sharply with the more introspective mood of deep winter. Conversations would turn increasingly toward plans and hopes for the coming agricultural year, while the community would begin to organise the cooperative efforts that would be needed for spring ploughing and planting. The medieval village's calendar of religious observances also reflected this transition towards spring, with the season of Lent providing a structured period of preparation and anticipation that paralleled the agricultural preparations taking place in the secular realm. The 40 days of fasting and penance that preceded Easter created a rhythm of spiritual preparation that gave deeper meaning to the physical preparations for spring. As winter gradually loosened its grip and the first warm days brought new energy to the village, families would begin the great spring cleaning that marked the transition between seasons. Houses that had been sealed against winter cold would be open to fresh air and sunlight, while accumulated dirt and debris from months of indoor living would be swept away in preparation for a new beginning. This cleaning was more than mere housekeeping. It was a ritual of renewal that symbolised the community's emergence from winter's cocoon into the active life of the growing season. Windows would be unshuttered, walls would be whitewashed, and floors would be scrubbed until they gleamed in the returning sunlight. The physical transformation of living spaces reflected and encouraged the psychological transformation from winter's inward focus to spring's outward energy. The medieval village preparing for spring was a community poised on the threshold of renewal, carrying forward the knowledge and relationships that had sustained it through winter's challenges, while looking ahead to the possibilities and responsibilities of another growing season. In these moments of transition, the full richness of village life was revealed, as practical necessity, spiritual meaning, and human connection combined to create communities that were far more than mere collections of houses and fields, but genuine expressions of humanity's eternal quest to create meaning and beauty in the face of uncertainty and change. The village's seasonal rhythms extended far beyond the agricultural calendar that governed so much of daily life, weaving themselves into the very fabric of social interaction and community identity. As spring arrived with its promise of renewal, the medieval village would transform from a tightly knit community focused on survival into a more expansive society, ready to engage with the wider world once again. The roads that had been impassable during winter would slowly dry and harden, making travel possible for the merchants, pilgrims, and wandering craftsmen who formed the threads connecting one village to another. Among the most eagerly anticipated visitors were the travelling peddlers, who carried news along with their wares. These hardy individuals, often walking miles between settlements, with their goods strapped to their backs or loaded onto small carts, served as living newspapers for communities that might otherwise remain isolated for months at a time. They brought word of marriages and deaths in neighbouring villages, news of political developments in distant kingdoms, and stories of strange happenings that would be retold around countless hearths in the evenings to come. The peddler's pack was a treasure trove of items that could not be produced locally. Salt, that precious commodity, essential for preserving meat and flavouring food, might come from coastal regions hundreds of miles away. Needles and pins crafted by specialised metalworkers in distant towns were small but vital tools that every household needed. Ribbons and coloured threads for embroidery added touches of beauty to the practical clothing that village women created during the long winter months. But perhaps most treasured were the spices and seasonings that could transform the monotonous diet of medieval peasants into something approaching a feast. A small packet of pepper, worth its weight in silver, could elevate a simple stew into a dish fit for celebration. Ginger, cinnamon, and other exotic flavourings carried the romance of distant lands and foreign markets, bringing dreams of far-off places to people whose horizons were usually limited by the next hill. The negotiations between villagers and travelling merchants were elaborate social rituals that involved far more than simple commercial exchange. The peddler would be invited to share meals and lodging, often in the home of the village's most prosperous family, where his stories and news would be as valuable as his goods. In return for this hospitality, he would be expected to provide detailed accounts of his travels, descriptions of other communities, and assessments of political and economic conditions in the regions he had visited. These conversations served multiple purposes for the medieval village. They provided entertainment during the quiet spring evenings, when outdoor work was not yet possible, but the bitter cold of winter had passed. They also supplied crucial information about market conditions, weather patterns in other areas, and potential threats or opportunities that might affect the community's welfare in the coming months. Most importantly, they maintained the village's connection to the broader medieval world, preventing the isolation that could lead to stagnation and decline. The spring season also brought the return of more specialised travelling professionals, whose services were essential to village life, but required skills that could not be maintained by small communities. The travelling judge, who might visit a village only once or twice a year, would hold court sessions that resolved disputes and administered justice according to both local custom and broader legal traditions. These sessions were major social events that drew people from surrounding areas, creating temporary festivals of law and order. The judge's arrival would be announced by horn blasts or bell ringing, summoning all villagers to gather in the churchyard or on the village green. A temporary court would be established, often using the church steps as a natural platform that elevated the judge above the assembled crowd. Cases that had been accumulating throughout the winter would be heard and decided, from boundary disputes between neighbours to accusations of theft or adultery that threatened community harmony. These legal proceedings were public theatre as much as judicial process, with the entire community serving as audience and jury. The judge would listen to testimony from accusers and defendants, examine evidence, and consult with local officials who understood the particular customs and circumstances of the village. The decisions reached would be binding parties, but were not only on the immediated, also set precedents that would guide future disputes. The punishment of crimes in the medieval village was designed not only to penalise wrongdoers, but also to reinforce community values and maintain social order. Minor offences might result in public humiliation through devices like the stocks or pillory, where the guilty party would be displayed for the mockery and disapproval of their neighbours. More serious crimes could result in fines, physical punishment, or even banishment from the community, a fate that was often equivalent to a death sentence in a world where survival depended on social cooperation. The travelling smith was another essential visitor whose skills were beyond the capacity of most villages to maintain permanently. While larger communities might have their own blacksmiths, smaller settlements often relied on itinerant craftsmen who moved from village to village according to seasonal patterns and local needs. The arrival of the smith would be greeted with excitement as families brought out their accumulated broken tools, worn horseshoes, and metal implements that needed repair or replacement. The temporary forge that the travelling smith would establish, often in the village square or near the church, became a centre of activity and interest. Children would gather to watch the magical until it glowed red hot, then process of heating iron, hammering it into new shapes on the anvil. The rhythmic ringing of hammer on metal provided a soundtrack for village life during the smith's visit, while the shower of sparks that flew from his work created a spectacular display that never lost its fascination. The smith's work was not merely functional but also artistic, as he crafted decorative ironwork that could beautify as well as serve practical purposes. A simple door latch might be shaped into an elegant curve, while horseshoes could be decorated with patterns that reflected both the owner's prosperity and the craftsman's skill. These touches of beauty in everyday objects reflected the medieval understanding that all human activities, no matter how humble, could be opportunities to create something pleasing to both God and neighbour. The spring season also marked the return of religious pilgrims who had spent the winter months in monastery guest houses or with sympathetic families along their routes. These travellers, identifiable by their simple robes, walking staffs, and the distinctive badges that marked their destinations, brought a different kind of news and wisdom to the villages they passed through. Their stories were of spiritual rather than commercial significance, but they were no less eagerly received by communities hungry for contact with the wider world. Pilgrims carried tales of miraculous healings at distant shrines, descriptions of magnificent cathedrals and holy relics, and accounts of the diverse expressions of faith they had encountered during their journeys. For villagers who might never travel more than a few miles from their birthplace, these stories opened windows onto a vast world of spiritual possibility and religious wonder. The presence of pilgrims also brought opportunities for the village to practice Christian charity, as hospitality to travellers was considered both a religious duty and a source of spiritual merit. The informal news network that pilgrims, merchants, and other travellers created was the medieval equivalent of our modern communication systems. Information about everything from crop failures in distant regions to political alliances between kingdoms would spread along these human chains, reaching even the most remote villages within weeks or months of the original events. This network was particularly important for warning communities about approaching dangers, whether natural disasters, disease outbreaks, or military conflicts that might threaten their safety. The The gradual warming of spring weather also allowed for the resumption of construction projects that had been suspended during the winter months. The village church, which was often the most ambitious architectural undertaking in the community, might see the return of skilled masons and carpenters who had spent the cold season working in warmer regions or on indoor projects. The sound of chiselling stone and sawing timber would join the chorus of spring sounds that marked the community's emergence from winter dormancy. Church construction, generational project that cooled in the medieval village, was a mull span decades or even centuries. Each family would contribute according to their means, whether through direct donations of money and materials or through the provision of labour for the simpler tasks that did not require specialised skills. The gradual progress of these building projects created a sense of continuity and shared purpose that strengthened community bonds across the years. The techniques used in medieval church construction were marvels of engineering and craftsmanship that had been developed and refined over centuries of building experience. Master masons possessed knowledge of structural principles that allowed them to create soaring spaces that seemed to defy the limitations of stone and mortar. Their weight create understanding of how to distribute stable arches and carve decorative elements that enhanced rather than weakened the building structure represented a sophisticated body of technical knowledge that was passed down through carefully guarded apprenticeship systems. The decorative arts that adorned medieval churches were equally sophisticated, representing the highest achievements of village craftsmanship applied to spiritual purposes. Wood carvers created intricate screens and choir stalls that combined practical function with religious symbolism. Stone masons carved capitals and doorways that told biblical stories in visual form for congregations who could not read written texts. Glaziers created windows that transformed sunlight into jeweled patterns of colour that seemed to bring heaven down to earth. The village's involvement in church construction and decoration provided opportunities for artistic expression that might otherwise have been lacking in lives dominated by agricultural necessity. A farmer whose daily work involved the practical tasks of ploughing and harvesting might discover hidden talents for carving or painting when called upon to contribute to the church project. These artistic endeavours enriched not only the building itself, but also the lives of the creators, providing outlets for creativity and beauty that elevated the human spirit above purely material concerns. The spring season also brought the renewal of trade relationships that had been suspended during the winter isolation. Village craftsmen would begin preparing their products for the markets and fairs that would be held during the warmer months when travel was possible and agricultural communities had surplus goods to trade. The potter would be moulding and firing vessels that would carry the village's reputation to distant markets. The weaver would be creating textiles whose quality and beauty would attract customers from other regions. These preparations for trade were collaborative efforts that involved entire families and often multiple households working together. The production of high-quality goods for external markets required skills, materials, and labour that exceeded what individual families could provide alone. Neighbours would pool their resources, sharing specialised tools, trading raw materials, and coordinating their efforts to create products that could compete successfully in the broader medieval economy. The anticipation of spring markets and fairs created an atmosphere of excitement and possibility that energised the entire village. Families would debate which goods would be most profitable to produce, what new techniques might give them competitive advantages, and how they could best present their products to attract potential buyers. These discussions reflected both practical business sense and the creative pride that medieval craftsmen took in their work. The village's preparations for participation in regional markets also required careful planning of transportation and logistics. Goods would need to be packed securely for the journey, often over rough roads and in unpredictable weather. Arrangements would need to be made for lodging and meals during market trips that might last several days or even weeks. family members would need to be assigned different responsibilities, with some staying home to maintain essential village activities while others travelled to represent the community in distant markets. As the days grew longer and the weather warmed, the medieval village would gradually shake off the introspective quiet of winter and embrace the active engagement with the world that characterised the growing season. The roads that had been silent and empty for months would begin to show signs of traffic, as travellers of all kinds resumed their journeys, and communities reconnected with the broader network of human activity that defined medieval civilization. The transformation from winter isolation to spring connectivity was more than merely practical. It represented a fundamental shift in the village's relationship with the world beyond its boundaries. During the cold months, the community had turned inward, relying on its own resources and maintaining itself through the strength of internal bonds and shared traditions. With spring's arrival, those same strong communities could reach outward, sharing their strengths with others and drawing new energy and ideas from the wider world. This cyclical pattern of withdrawal and engagement, isolation and connection reflected the deeper rhythms that governed all aspects of medieval life. Just as the agricultural year moved through seasons of planting, growing, harvesting and rest, so too did the social and economic life of the village follow patterns of expansion and contraction that had been shaped by centuries of experience and adaptation to the realities of their world. The medieval village in spring was a community poised between worlds, carrying forward the intimate knowledge and close relationships that had sustained it through winter, while opening itself to the possibilities and challenges that came with renewed contact with the broader medieval world. In this moment of transition, the village embodied the essential characteristics that made these communities so resilient and enduring. The ability to maintain their distinctive identity while adapting to changing circumstances, the strength that came from deep roots combined with the flexibility to grow in new directions, and the wisdom to know when to hold fast to tradition and when to embrace the opportunities that came with change. As we listen to the gentle sounds of this awakening village, perhaps we can find in their example a reminder of the importance of community, the value of shared efforts, and the eternal hope that comes with each new season's promise of renewal and growth. In their simple but profound understanding of life's rhythms, these medieval villagers created communities that sustained not only physical survival, but also the human need for meaning, beauty, and connection that transcends the boundaries of any single time or place. The arrival of summer brought with it a different quality of light and life to the medieval village, as if the very air had been transformed from the crisp transparency of spring into something richer and more golden. The sun, which had seemed distant and weak during the winter months, now climbed high into the sky each day, casting sharp shadows and filling the village lanes with warmth that penetrated deep into stone walls and thatched roofs that had known only cold for so many months. This was the season when the village truly came alive, when every corner and hidden space revealed the full extent of medieval community life. Gardens that had been mere plots of brown earth just weeks before now burst with the vibrant greens of growing vegetables and herbs. The beans climbed their carefully constructed wooden frames, their broad leaves creating patches of welcome shade, while rows of cabbages spread their sturdy leaves wide to catch every precious ray of sunlight. The herb gardens, tended primarily by the village women, became fragrant sanctuaries where the scents of lavender, rosemary, and thyme mingled with the earthier aromas of leeks and onions. These gardens were more than mere sources of food and flavouring. They were living pharmacies where the village's medical knowledge was preserved in growing form. The wise women who tended these plots could identify dozens of plants by their leaves, flowers, and roots, understanding precisely when each should be harvested and how it should be prepared to treat everything from a child's fever to an elder's aching joints. The summer mornings began before dawn, when the air was still cool and the dew heavy on every blade of grass. Families would rise with the first pale light in the eastern sky, knowing that the day's work would be easier if begun before the sun reached its full strength. The sound of wooden shutters being opened would echo through the village as households prepared for another day of the intense activity that characterized the growing season. The village well became a centre of early morning social activity, as women and children arrived with their wooden buckets and ceramic jugs to draw the precious water that would be needed for cooking, cleaning, and the countless other tasks that kept medieval households functioning. The well itself was often one of the village's most carefully maintained structures, surrounded by a stone wall that prevented contamination and covered by a wooden roof that protected the water source from both weather and debris. These morning gatherings around the well were important social moments when news was shared, plans were made, and the informal networks of mutual support that held the community together were renewed each day. A mother might mention that her child had been feverish during the night, leading to offers of herbal remedies and promises of help with household tasks. An elderly widow might receive assistance carrying her heavy water jug home, while sharing in return the wisdom of her many years of village life. The conversations that took place during these daily water-gathering expeditions served as the village's primary means of internal communication. Information about everything from the health of livestock to the progress of crops in different fields would be exchanged and evaluated by the collective wisdom of the community. These discussions helped coordinate the village's activities, ensuring that everyone understood what needed to be done and when, while also providing opportunities for neighbours to offer help to those who might be struggling with particular challenges. The summer days were long and filled with activities that took full advantage of the favourable weather and extended daylight. The men would be in the fields by sunrise, tending the growing crops with the careful attention that meant the difference between abundance and scarcity in the coming winter. The grain was now tall enough to wave gently in the summer breezes, creating seas of green that stretched to the horizon and promised the golden harvest that would come with autumn's arrival. Weeding was one of the most important and labour-intensive tasks of the summer season. Every unwanted plant that competed with the grain for soil nutrients and moisture had to be carefully removed by hand, a process that required entire families to work together in the fields for hours at a time. Children as young as 5 or 6 would join these weeding parties, their small hands perfect for reaching into tight spaces between the grain stalks, where larger hands might damage the precious crops. The work of weeding was made more pleasant by the songs and stories that accompanied it, turning necessary labour into social occasions that strengthened family bonds and preserved cultural traditions. Work songs with simple, repetitive melodies helped coordinate the rhythm of the labour while making the time pass more quickly. These songs often told stories of legendary harvests, celebrated the beauty of growing things, or simply expressed the satisfaction that came from honest work well done. The village livestock required constant attention during the summer months, as the animals needed to be moved regularly between different pastures to prevent overgrazing and ensure they had access to the most nutritious grass. The village cowherd, often a young person whose family could spare them from field work, would lead the community's cattle to different grazing areas each day, following ancient patterns that had been established through generations of experience with the local landscape. These pastoral scenes, with cattle moving slowly across green meadows under the guidance of a young shepherd, represented one of the most peaceful aspects of medieval village life. The animals themselves seemed to understand the rhythms of their care, gathering at familiar spots when the time came to return to their shelters for the night. The gentle lowing of contented cattle and the soft bleating of sheep created a pastoral symphony that spoke of prosperity and the successful harmony between human needs and natural abundance. The summer season also brought an increase in the variety and quality of food available to village families. Gardens produced fresh vegetables that added both nutrition and flavour to the basic diet of bread and porridge that sustained most peasant households throughout the year. Lettuce, radishes, and young peas provided crisp textures and bright flavours that were especially welcome after months of preserved and dried foods. The village orchards, which had shown such promise during their spring flowering, now began to fulfil that promise with the first early fruits of summer. Cherries ripened in clusters of ruby red, providing sweet treats that children would remember long after the fruit was gone. Apple trees, heavy with developing fruit, promised the abundance that would come with autumn's harvest, while their broad leaves provided welcome shade during the heat of summer afternoons. Beekeeping was another important summer activity that required specialised knowledge and careful attention. The village beekeeper, often someone who had inherited both the hives and the knowledge from previous generations, would tend the wooden boxes that housed these valuable insects. Honey was one of the few sources of sweetness available to medieval communities, making it precious beyond measure for both culinary and medicinal purposes. The process of working with bees required a deep understanding of their behaviour and needs. The beekeeper would approach the hives during the calm periods of the day, often early morning or evening, when the bees were less active. Protective clothing was minimal by our standards, usually consisting of a thick cloth draped over the head and face, but experienced beekeepers developed an intuitive sense of when the bees were calm and when it was better to leave them undisturbed. Harvesting honey was a delicate operation that required removing the wax combs without destroying the hive structure or harming the bees that would continue to produce honey throughout the season. The honeycomb itself was valuable, as the wax could be used for making the finest candles, while the honey would be carefully stored in sealed containers that would preserve its sweetness and nutritional value for months. The summer evenings in the medieval village had a different character from those of other seasons, as the extended daylight allowed for activities that were impossible during the shorter days of winter and spring. After the day's work in the fields and gardens was complete, families might gather in their doorways or on simple benches outside their homes to enjoy the cool evening air and watch the sun slowly set behind the familiar hills that bounded their world. These evening gatherings provided opportunities for the quieter social interactions that were just as important to village life as the more organised communal activities. Neighbours might share the day's experiences, discussing the progress of their crops or the behaviour of their animals. Children would play simple games in the dusty lanes between houses, their laughter and calls adding to the peaceful atmosphere of a community at rest after a day of productive labour. The longer evenings also provided time for courtship among the village's young people, though always under the watchful supervision of parents and neighbours who had strong interests in ensuring that romantic relationships developed along appropriate lines. Young men might find excuses to walk past the homes of young women they admired, while the women would make sure to be visible during these evening promenades, perhaps working on embroidery or other handcrafts that displayed their domestic skills. These courtship rituals were elaborate social dances that involved not only the potential couples, but their entire families and the broader community. A young man's interest in a particular young woman would be observed and discussed by everyone in the village, while the woman's family would carefully evaluate his prospects as a potential provider and his reputation as a person of good character and steady habits. The summer season also brought increased contact with the outside world, as travelling merchants and craftsmen found the roads easier to navigate and the weather more conducive to extended journeys. The village would receive visits from specialists whose skills were too rare to be maintained locally, but whose services were essential for maintaining the tools and equipment that made agricultural life possible. The travelling tinker was a welcome visitor who could repair the metal pots and pans that were essential for cooking, but too valuable to discard when they developed holes or other damage. Using techniques passed down through generations of itinerant craftsmen, the tinker could patch damaged vessels, sharpen knives and tools, and even create new implements from scraps of metal that might otherwise have been considered worthless. These visiting specialists brought more than just their technical skills. They also carried news and gossip from other communities, creating informal networks of communication that connected even remote villages to the broader currents of medieval life. A tinker might report that grain prices were rising in a distant market town, information that could influence a village's decisions about how much of their harvest to keep and how much to sell. Or he might bring word of a new agricultural technique being used in another region, knowledge that could potentially improve local farming practices. The summer months were also when many villages would host their annual fairs and markets, events that transformed quiet agricultural communities into bustling commercial centres that attracted visitors from miles around. The preparations for these fairs began weeks in advance, as families decided which products they would offer for sale and began the intensive work of creating goods that would attract buyers and bring credit to their community. Village craftsmen would spend long hours perfecting their finest work for display at these fairs. The potter would create vessels that showcased not only practical utility, but also artistic beauty, with decorative glazes and elegant shapes that demonstrated mastery of ancient techniques. The weaver would produce textiles of exceptional quality, with complex patterns and fine workmanship that reflected both individual skill and the community's reputation for excellence. The anticipation that built toward these summer fairs created an atmosphere of excitement and possibility that energized the entire village. Children would talk endlessly about the entertainers and exotic goods they hoped to see, while adults made careful calculations about which purchases would be most beneficial for their families and their work. These fairs represented opportunities not only for commerce, but also for social interaction, entertainment, and the renewal of relationships with people from other communities. On the day of the fair, the village would be transformed beyond recognition. Temporary stalls would line the main street and Sir Green, creating a mass around the village of commercial activity where local products competed with exotic goods brought by travelling merchants from distant regions. The air would be filled with the calls of vendors advertising their wares, the sounds of musicians and entertainers, and the general hubbub of crowds enjoying the excitement of a special occasion. Food vendors would offer treats that were rare luxuries in normal village life, from honey cakes and fruit tarts to roasted meats and exotic spices that could transform ordinary ingredients into memorable feasts. Families would save for months to afford these special indulgences, viewing them not as mere food but as celebrations of abundance and community prosperity. The social aspects of these summer fairs were just as important as the commercial activities. Young people from different villages would meet relationships that might and lead to marriages linking communities together. Craftsmen would compare techniques and share knowledge that could improve their skills and products. Farmers would discuss new crops and agricultural methods that might increase their productivity and prosperity. As the summer progressed toward its peak, the medieval village would settle into rhythms of work and rest that made full use of the favourable weather while preparing for the challenges that would come with autumn's approach. The intensity of summer agricultural work required careful pacing, as families needed to maintain their energy and health through months of demanding physical labour. The midday rest, when the sun was too hot for comfortable outdoor work, became an important part of the daily routine. Families would gather in whatever shade they could find, often under the spreading branches of ancient trees that had been carefully preserved as the village grew around them. These rest periods provided opportunities for quiet conversation, simple meals, and the restoration of energy needed for the afternoon's work. The village's water sources became increasingly important during the hottest summer days, as both humans and animals required more frequent drinking to stay healthy in the heat. Wells would be checked regularly to ensure they were not running low, while streams and ponds that provided water for livestock would be carefully monitored and protected from contamination. The management of water resources required community cooperation and careful planning, as the decisions made by individual families could affect the welfare of their neighbours. Upstream users had to be mindful of those who depended on water sources below them, while everyone had to work together to maintain the cleanliness and accessibility of shared water supplies. As the summer days began to grow imperceptibly shorter and the first hints of autumn appeared in the changing angle of sunlight, the medieval village would begin to shift its focus toward the crucial harvest season that would determine everyone's fate through the coming winter. The grain in the fields would be watched with increasing intensity as experienced farmers looked for the subtle signs that would indicate the perfect moment to begin the harvest that represented a full year's labour and hope. The summer season in the medieval village represented the fullest expression of community life, when favourable weather, abundant daylight, and the promise of harvest combined to create an atmosphere of prosperity and possibility. Yet even during these most favourable months, the underlying realities of medieval existence remained present, reminding villagers that their comfortable circumstances were temporary gifts that required constant effort and cooperation to maintain. The successful navigation of summer's opportunities and challenges required the same qualities that sustained medieval villages through all seasons: careful planning, mutual support, adaptability to changing circumstances, and the wisdom that came from generations of accumulated experience. In mastering these summer rhythms, medieval villagers demonstrated their remarkable ability to create rich, meaningful lives within the constraints and possibilities of their world, building communities that could thrive even while remaining vulnerable to forces beyond their control. As we listen to the sounds of this medieval summer evening, with children playing in the dusty lanes and families gathering to enjoy the cooling air, we can perhaps appreciate the profound accomplishment these communities represented in their ability to create beauty, meaning, and genuine human flourishing in a world that demanded so much while offering so little in the way of material comfort or security. Their success in building lives worth living under such challenging circumstances offers lessons that remain relevant across the centuries that separate their world from our own. The rhythm of medieval village life was never more evident than during these precious summer weeks, when the entire community seemed to move in harmony with the natural world around them. Children who had spent the winter huddled indoors now ran freely through the lanes, their bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust as they chased each other in games that had been played by countless generations before them. Their laughter rang across the village green and off the stone walls of houses, creating a soundtrack of pure joy that reminded everyone of life's essential goodness. These games were not mere idle entertainment, but served important functions in preparing young people for their adult roles in the community. Boys would practice with wooden swords and shields, learning the basic movements that might someday be needed to defend their families and village. Girls would play elaborate games of house and family, developing the domestic skills and social understanding they would need as wives and mothers. Both boys and girls would participate in contests of running, jumping, and throwing that built the physical strength and coordination essential for agricultural work. The village elders would watch these childhood activities with the fond understanding that came from having once been young themselves, seeing in each new generation the continuation of traditions that stretched back beyond memory. Occasionally, a grandfather might join in a game, demonstrating skills that had been sharpened by decades of experience, or sharing stories that connected present play to ancient customs and meanings. The summer months also brought a particular richness to the village's religious life, as the favourable weather allowed for outdoor processions and celebrations that were impossible during the harsher seasons. The feast days of various saints would be marked with colourful ceremonies that combined solemn worship with joyful community celebration, creating events that nourished both soul and spirit. On these holy days, the entire village would participate in processions that wound through the streets and fields, carrying banners and religious images that had been lovingly preserved and decorated throughout the year. The parish priest would lead these processions in his finest vestments, while villagers would follow behind singing hymns whose melodies had been passed down through generations of faithful celebration. The church itself would be transformed for these special occasions, decorated with flowers from village gardens and illuminated by precious candles that cast dancing shadows on ancient stone walls. The familiar space that served for weekly worship would become something magical and transcendent, filled with scents of incense and blooming flowers that lifted the spirits and reminded everyone of the beauty that faith could bring to even the humblest circumstances. These religious celebrations served to strengthen the bonds that held the community together, reminding villagers of their shared beliefs and common destiny. Rich and poor would kneel side by side on the stone floor, united in prayers that transcended the social divisions that marked their daily lives. Children would participate with the wide-eyed wonder that made even familiar rituals seem fresh and meaningful, while their parents found comfort in traditions that provided stability and meaning in an uncertain world. The summer season was also when many villages would undertake the most ambitious community projects, taking advantage of favourable weather and the availability of labour during the brief respite between spring planting and autumn harvest. A village might decide to rebuild a section of the church that had been damaged by winter storms, or to construct a new bridge over a stream that had caused difficulties for travellers and traders. These community construction projects required careful planning and coordination, as families had to balance their contributions to the common good with their individual needs and responsibilities. The wealthiest villages might provide materials and funds, while those of more modest means would contribute their labour and skills. Everyone understood that these projects benefited the entire community and that individual prosperity depended on the collective welfare of the village. The techniques used in medieval construction were marvels of practical engineering that made efficient use of local materials and traditional skills. Stone would be quarried from nearby hills and shaped by experienced masons whose knowledge of structural principles had been refined through generations of building experience. Timber would be selected and prepared according to ancient wisdom about which trees provided the strongest and most durable wood for different purposes. The raising of a new building was always a community celebration, as neighbours gathered to help lift heavy beams and stones into place through coordinated effort that required both strength and precise timing. These barn-raising events, as they came to be known, combined necessary work with social festivity, creating memories that would be treasured long after the building was complete. Women would prepare elaborate feasts to sustain the workers through their demanding labour, while children would run errands and fetch tools as needed. The elderly would offer advice based on their experience with previous construction projects, while skilled craftsmen would direct the work and ensure that everything was done according to proper techniques and standards. The completion of such projects brought enormous satisfaction to the entire village, as everyone could see the tangible results of their cooperation and shared effort. A new church tower rising against the sky, or a sturdy bridge spanning a previously troublesome stream, served as permanent reminders of what could be accomplished when the community worked together toward common goals. Summer evenings provided time for more leisurely pursuits that enriched the cultural life of the village beyond the necessities of survival and work. Storytelling reached new heights during these months, as the longer days provided more time for elaborate narratives and the comfortable weather made outdoor gatherings more pleasant. Village elders would share tales that had been polished through countless retellings, while younger adults might contribute stories of their own experiences and adventures. These storytelling sessions often took place in natural amphitheatres created by the arrangement of houses around the village green, with listeners arranged in comfortable circles that allowed everyone to hear clearly while enjoying the cooling evening air. The stories themselves ranged from ancient legends and religious tales to more contemporary accounts of interesting events and memorable characters from the village's own history. Music also flourished during the summer months, as favourable weather allowed for outdoor performances and celebrations that were impossible during colder seasons. Village musicians would practice and perfect their skills, preparing for the harvest festivals that would mark the culmination of the agricultural year. Simple instruments crafted from local materials would produce melodies that captured both the joy of summer abundance and the underlying awareness that this prosperity was temporary and precious. Dancing was another summer evening activity that brought the entire community together in expressions of shared joy and cultural continuity. The village green would become a natural dance floor, with families and neighbours joining in circle dances and line dances that required no special skill but created moving patterns of human connection and celebration. These dances served multiple social functions beyond mere entertainment, providing opportunities for young people to interact under appropriate supervision while allowing the entire community to participate in cultural traditions that connected them to their ancestors and their identity as a people. The steps and patterns of these dances carried meanings that went beyond their surface appearance, embodying values of cooperation, harmony, and shared celebration that were essential to village life. The summer months also brought an intensification of trade relationships that connected the village to broader regional and international networks of commerce and communication. Merchants who had avoided travel during the harsh winter months would now make regular visits, bringing exotic goods and news from distant places that expanded the villagers' understanding of the wider world. These commercial relationships were built on a trust and mutual benefit that developed over years of repeated interaction. A merchant who dealt fairly with village customers and provided quality goods at reasonable prices would develop a loyal following that ensured his continued success, while villagers who produced superior crafts and agricultural products would build reputations that attracted buyers from ever-widening circles of potential customers. The negotiations that surrounded these commercial transactions were elaborate social rituals that involved far more than simple economic exchange. Merchants and villagers would spend time sharing meals and conversation, building personal relationships that made business dealings more pleasant and reliable. These relationships often extended across generations, with trading partnerships being passed down from parents to children like valuable inheritances. The goods that flowed through these trading networks brought touches of luxury and variety to village life that would have been impossible through local production alone. Spices from distant lands could transform simple meals into memorable feasts, while fine textiles and metalwork could add beauty and status to otherwise humble households. Books and written materials, though rare and precious, occasionally found their way to villages where they would be treasured by the few who could read and shared through oral transmission with the broader community. As the summer reached its peak and began the gradual transition toward autumn, villagers would start the psychological and practical preparations for the harvest season that would soon dominate their lives. Families would assess their food stores and household supplies, making plans for the intensive work period ahead and the winter months that would follow the harvest. Tools would be examined and repaired in preparation for the demanding work of cutting and gathering grain, while storage facilities would be cleaned and prepared to receive the precious in the community through another crops that would sustain winter. These preparations required careful attention to detail, as inadequate tools or improper storage could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity in the months ahead. The community would also begin the social preparations for harvest time, renewing agreements about labour sharing and mutual assistance that would be essential during the intensive work period. Families would discuss which members would be available for field work and which would need to remain home to tend children or maintain other essential activities. These arrangements required delicate balancing of individual needs with community requirements, negotiations that drew on years of experience and established traditions. Young people who had come of age during the year would prepare to take on adult responsibilities during their first full harvest season, marking an important transition in their lives and status within the community. Parents would provide instruction and encouragement while gradually transferring real responsibility to the next generation, continuing the ancient process by which practical knowledge and social roles were passed from one generation to the next. And so, dear listener, as our gentle journey through these medieval lanes draws to its peaceful close, we've witnessed the timeless rhythms that bound communities together through seasons of joy and hardship alike. From the crackling hearths of winter to the golden harvests of autumn, these humble villages reveal the enduring power of human connection and shared purpose. Perhaps tonight, as you drift into restful slumber, you might carry with you the quiet wisdom of those who found profound meaning in life's simplest moments. Sleep well, and thank you for joining me in this tranquil corner of history.